Thomas J. Scheff, Microsociology. Foreword by Anthony Giddens. This book is by any token a major contribution to some central debates in social theory at the present time. On the face of things, the argument seems to concern the development of a microsociology concerned with the details of social interaction. It is a much more profound study than such a characterization suggests. What Thomas Scheff seeks to develop is essentially a quite novel account of the nature of social life, its relation to language and human reflexivity, in which he insists upon the importance of a theory of emotion. The core of Scheff's analysis concerns his discussion of the connection between emotion and motivation, in which he places a special stress upon the significance of pride and shame as more or less continuous aspects of human experience. Scheff then relates this motivational analysis to what is to my mind a quite brilliant account of the massive complexity of the everyday understanding of meaning between speakers and agents. He demonstrates this complexity both by direct empirical analysis and by taking literary texts as exemplifications. In the interpretation of meaning, he suggests human actors routinely employ what the philosopher Peirce called abduction, which in this instance refers to rapid searches that continuously have to be employed to create an intelligible social world. Not content to leave things there, he then moves on to the attempt to work out a theory of individuality and genius. I found these sections particularly arresting and important. This is not a book which fits easily into conventional categories. It is not written in a strictly narrative form, but combines insights drawn from a variety of sources in an eclectic fashion. The style is quite often idiosyncratic, yet it is a work of true originality and jolting impact. To appreciate how important this new book is, one must understand something about the current state of development of sociology. With some exceptions, most sociological work, particularly on a theoretical level, has been dominated by cognitive interpretations of action and institutions. The major debates in social theory have concerned issues such as how far methodological individualism or holism is appropriate as a model for social analysis, or how far human activity can be understood in terms of models of rational choice. Scheff's work breaks away from these more traditional concerns. In particular, he focuses upon the significance of emotion in human social relations, showing that no approach to sociology can be complete which fails to analyze this. He also develops a highly innovative account of emotional life, giving a central place to pride and shame in the sustaining of self-identity. He relates this account of pride and shame to the social bond, the structuring foundation of day-to-day life and of larger social systems. As a result of this new perspectives, he is able to make major contributions to rethinking pre-existing conceptions of self and society. Scheff ranges over an extraordinary diversity of sources which stretch well beyond those ordinarily associated with sociological investigation. The reader should be forewarned. This is not a simple book to follow, nor does it fit snugly into the usual categories of sociological thought. But these very characteristics help give the work its originality and intellectual power. In presenting some of the aforementioned themes of the book, let me, in true hermeneutic fashion, begin in the middle, working back to the beginning, and from there move to the end of the volume. In Chapter 7, the fulcrum of his study, Scheff offers a discussion of an incident from Goethe's Werther. Why do we find an analysis of a literary text in an academic work of sociology? Goethe's intellectual career captures some of the features of both art and science which Scheff wants to address in his own work. Goethe was one of the greatest scientists of his time as well as a leading literary figure. Goethe's work in both spheres illustrates a fundamental principle with which Scheff is concerned: the relation between concrete phenomena in all their idiosyncratic richness and more abstract characteristics or generalizations. Goethe's fiction provides many detailed accounts of episodes of interaction, describing inner thoughts and feelings as well as outer behavior. Werther, Scheff thinks, was probably an as-if autobiography. Goethe was a man of middle-class background seeking to make a place for himself in a society dominated by a traditional aristocracy. He did in fact forge an acceptable status for himself in that society. His literary genius and scientific accomplishments brought him considerable fame, and he also held high governmental positions. Werther might be regarded as a literary thought experiment. What would Goethe's own life have been like if he were a more ordinary man from a middle-class background, not a person of exceptional talent and energy? Werther is originally seen purely as a story of unrequited love. Werther falls into a state of despair, having conceived a passion for a woman who is promised to another, and eventually kills himself. Scheff points out that Werther's failures in love are actually part of a wider series of setbacks or humiliations he experiences. Werther's life is haunted by shame, never fully acknowledged either by himself or by others. His tribulations are caused less by the rebuffs he has to endure than by his denial of his emotional reactions to them. He is caught in a, quote, feeling trap, in which the emotions of shame and anger intensify internally without finding full external expression. Feeling traps, Scheff argues, are characteristic of most systems of social deference or unequal status. Goethe's story, therefore, allows us to move from the particular incidents of the narrative to a generalized account of patterns of deference and inequality. The notion of feeling trap, which Scheff derives from the psychologist Helen B. Lewis, is used in other parts of Scheff's book to explore the origins of self-esteem and the nature of the social bond. The theme of genius is pursued by Scheff in relation to a discussion of language acquisition. Genius is normally taken to refer to the talents and accomplishments of a few, very rare individuals, like Goethe himself. Modern linguistics, however, has demonstrated that, in a certain sense, all human beings possess qualities of genius, demonstrated in their capability to master a natural language. Learning such a language is an enormously complicated endeavor, so complicated that even the most advanced computers cannot manage to come to terms with it. Yet virtually all children, by the age of 4 or 5, have somehow gained access to the rules, procedures, tactics, social knowledge, and other items involved in everyday language use. Why are there so few geniuses in fields of invention, discovery, or artistic attainment when genius in this sense is a general characteristic of the human species? According to Scheff, exposure to language, coupled with instruction from supremely competent teachers, in other words, adult language users, saturates the child's early life. No other forms of symbolic learning or instruction, music or mathematics, for example, are so intense, save for a few people brought up in constant contact with them. Most of the great musical composers, Scheff points out, had one or more relatives who were gifted musicians and were exposed to musical instruction from the very early years of their lives onward. This is one condition of exceptional accomplishment in music and other creative spheres. Taken on its own, it is not sufficient. To produce genius, it has to be coupled to a firmly entrenched base of self-esteem. The person who has such inner confidence from early years retains access to the intuitions and perceptions that in most people become constrained or repressed. We find here some key dynamics of pride, shame, and self-identity. For a person to be possessed of genius, in the individualistic sense, she or he must have escaped the shame-rage dynamics which afflict the less gifted. Scheff does not suggest that this interpretation provides a complete explanation of individual genius, a phenomenon which in any case admits of no very precise definition. It is particularly relevant, he suggests, to the easy creator, the person who produces exceptional work quickly and with little revision. Creativity of this sort is released when there is a relative absence of self-censure, and where the individual can draw directly upon the original fund of ideation which all human beings possess. But only the few can harness in boldly innovative fashion. Goethe was just such an easy creator. Perception of the self by others, in relation to the bonds of day-to-day life, is the main focus of feelings of pride and shame. Goffman's celebrated analysis of embarrassment, in Scheff's view, opens up some of the main connections here. The risk of embarrassment, Goffman points out, is contained in every social encounter. Embarrassment is loss of face, which occurs when an individual is caught out in a process of interaction, inadvertently revealing to another something which should stay hidden, or witnessing another person thus being caught out. For all its virtues, however, Goffman's account of embarrassment does not relate loss of face to inner emotions, the crucial emphasis of Scheff. The conception of the feeling trap allows for a more profound understanding of what Scheff calls the, quote, deference emotion system, end quote, in social interaction, than is possible using Goffman's account alone. Embarrassment, Goffman tends to presume, may be agonizing but is usually transitory. If we understand that embarrassment is integral to shame and linked to anger, we see that it often has enduring consequences. Moreover, interaction rituals between large collectives, even nations, may incorporate spirals of shame and anger linked to conceptions of honor, insult, and retribution, which can have far-reaching implications for social life. The achievement of joint attention and feeling in interaction Scheff describes as attunement. It follows from his analysis that social bonds presume not just a cognitive, but an emotional connectedness between participants. Scheff shows how this is so even in the simplest context of day-to-day talk. Scheff shows how, little of what gets said in everyday conversation, as sociolinguistics has demonstrated, is in the words themselves. Grasping what another person means by an utterance demands an intricate knowledge of the cultural settings of interaction. Such taken-for-granted forms of knowledge include factors directly bound up with the deference emotion system. Speakers demand mutual esteem from one another in any situation of talk. For instance, someone who breaks in when another person is speaking shows disregard for the other's autonomy and integrity. A person who allows too lengthy a pause between conversational exchanges risks being seen as disrespectful. Codes of deference are therefore built into the minutiae of everyday talk. Emotional attunement is necessary to the interpretive understanding upon which interpersonal communication depends. Understanding what another person says thus presumes not only generalized social knowledge, but the constant gauging of the others and one's own inner feelings. A subtle process of tacking backwards and forwards between observation and imaginative inference is incorporated within everyday talk, a process very similar to what Charles Peirce described as abduction when analyzing the creative character of scientific activity. Abduction in day-to-day talk, as in science, is heavily counterfactual. Individuals are, as it were, continually imagining what might happen if certain utterances or actions were not produced. Scientific thought here rejoins art, as Scheff initially points out in his discussion of Goethe. Writing a foreword to another person's book is a difficult affair, however much one might admire both the individual and the work. I am not sure how far I am properly attuned to Scheff's discourse, or how far my own powers of abduction have proved up to the task of whetting the reader's appetite for what is to follow. Inevitably, I have some disagreements with, or worries about, aspects of Scheff's presentation. For instance, he does not consider at any length the question of what emotions actually are, a problem of very considerable difficulty. But then any and every book is open to critical reservations. This is a work of exceptional interest which bears witness to the very creativity which it puts at the center of human social conduct. Preface. This book proposes a new theory and method for the human sciences. The theory asserts that social bonds generate the primary motives in human conduct. Pride and shame, signals of the state of the bond, are also fundamental motives. The method is based on Peirce's idea of abduction, the rapid shuttling back and forth between imagination and observation, between deduction and induction. As I hope to show, my approach unifies seeming opposites: individual group, qualitative quantitative, micro-macro, theory research, art science. The writing of this book involved 5 years of hard labor, struggle, and excitement. It would have been impossible to complete without the help of what may be deemed either a large committee or a small army. Etc., etc. Thank you. Indebted to lots of people. Okay, part 1, introduction. Chapter 1, Human Nature and the Social Bond. This book should be seen as a first pass, a preview perhaps, of a new kind of sociology. It is based on an underlying conception of human nature quite different from those current in the social sciences. Although the very concept of human nature is unfashionable at the moment, It serves as the unnoticed backdrop of every investigation into human conduct. I am referring here not to the models that the various schools of thought use in their published work, but to an underlying orientation so primitive that it is seldom discussed, even between the closest colleagues. My purpose is to stimulate discussion of this issue by proposing a theory radically different from the prevailing ones. In this chapter, I provide a brief sketch of the basic ideas and will return to them, and to some of them repeatedly, in subsequent chapters. Even though motivational systems are usually not discussed, every analysis of human behavior implies them. Most approaches emphasize a single motive, such as money, power, or prestige. Some are more complex, assuming a system of motives involving several vectors. Orthodox psychoanalytic theory, for instance, points to the seeking of pleasure, such as sexual or oral fulfillment, as a positive motive, and the avoidance of anxiety and guilt as negative ones, a system for maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. The motives in this system are specific. Learning theory also assumes pleasure and pain as basic motives, but is extremely broad and vague about their sources, any kind of repetitive reinforcement in the environment. The prevailing approaches initially appear quite different from each other, but a closer examination shows important similarities among them. First of all, the theories can be divided into two broad groups, those that are narrow, like psychoanalysis, emphasizing only a few specific motives, and those that are extremely broad, like learning theory, so abstract that they explain everything, and therefore nothing. Common to all the various approaches is the simplicity of the system that they assume. For the most part, they treat human beings as if they were no more complex than an input-output device, like a transistor. As will be discussed below, human understanding is much more complex than the most complex computer, which contains thousands of transistors and other devices. I will return to this issue. A final similarity is that most approaches to motives focus on isolated individuals. At least in Western thinking, motives, almost by definition, occur within individuals. Current approaches to motives are based on theoretical and methodological individualism. The way in which laboratory experiments and sample surveys are usually collected provides a striking example of this point. These designs employ isolated individual subjects without reference to their webs of social relationships, as if they were irrelevant. Social bonds. Although not denying the usefulness of the prevailing approaches, or the reality of the underlying motives they assume, this book proposes maintenance of bonds as the most crucial human motive. This motive is seldom discussed, yet it may underlie, or at least color, virtually all human behavior. The concept of the bond to be sketched here is quite complex, ramifying into many seemingly disparate aspects of conduct. It does not assume isolated individuals, but connects individual behavior with social structure and process. Secure social bonds are the force that holds a society together. In my definition, this force involves a balance between closeness and distance, what Bowen has called differentiation. Bowen, a psychiatrist, is one of the originators of family system theory. Optimal differentiation defines an intact social bond, a bond which balances the needs of the individual and the needs of the group. It involves being able to maintain ties with others who are different from the self. The family that defines loyalty in terms of conformity, of being like other members of the family rather than different from them, exemplifies under-differentiation. In such a family, the other members feel betrayed by a member who develops his or her direction rather than conforms to the direction taken by the family. In this family, the individual members are engulfed. At the other pole are families in which the bonds are too loose. The individual is everything, the group is nothing. The individual members are isolated. Optimal differentiation involves closeness since it requires the knowledge of the other's point of view, but it also involves distance, the acceptance of the other's independence from self. An intact social bond does not imply agreement, but knowledge and acceptance of both agreement and disagreement. The usefulness of the concept of level of differentiation is not limited to family systems, but can be extended to all social relationships. The idea of optimal differentiation is implied by Durkheim's typology of suicide. Anomic egoistic suicide implies relationships in which there is too much distance, altruistic, too little. His analysis suggests that suicide is caused by pathological social bonds. Significantly, however, Durkheim does not discuss the structure of a normal bond. It goes without saying in his analysis. The degree and type of differentiation in a social system may be crucial for its survival since it determines its adaptive capacity. As Bowen 1978 indicates for the family, level of differentiation seems to generate the degree of rigidity or adaptiveness of the unit as a whole. Too little distance provides overconformity, just as too much produces underconformity. Some balance seems to be necessary to allow for the system to maintain coherence, a mixture of tradition and change. Although at first sight the level of differentiation seems similar to the distinction Durkheim made between mechanical and organic solidarity, the overlap is slight. Durkheim's distinction is strictly behavioral. It does not encompass the main elements in Bowen's idea, which concern internal as well as external states. Organic solidarity concerns cooperative behavior. Optimal differentiation, in Bowen's sense, concerns the intellectual and emotional attunement, mutual understanding, as well as behavioral interdependence. At present, there is no usable model of a normal social bond in the literature of the social sciences. Sociologists are at least aware of the bond, which sets them apart from most of the other human sciences. Modern sociology, following Durkheim, postulates that social order depends upon exterior and constraining social bonds. In Etzioni's 1989 critique of the liberal communitarian debate in political theory, he reminds both sides of the human arch. An arch is composed of bricks, but bricks without the arch are a pile of rubble. Absent from Etzioni's discussion of the arch is any description of the forces that bind the bricks together. As Etzioni indicates, the liberal communitarian argument suffers from a lack of specificity. Neither side makes explicit what it means by the principal terms in the debate. In this book, I propose a step towards specifying the terms by outlining a model of the relationship between individual and group. Without specificity, it may be possible for such arguments to continue in perpetuity. The social bond and its collective counterpart, social solidarity, remains a black box in sociological analysis, an idea of unspecified content that is accepted without discussion or criticism. Boudon, 1986, makes a distinction between black and white boxes quite relevant to the current situation in social theory. The idea of black boxes originated in electrical engineering, where it has no negative connotation. In wiring diagrams of complex electronic systems, the elements of subsystems, the parts and their interconnections, are omitted. A subsystem, like a transducer, is represented by a box empty except for its name, since the actual wiring diagram can easily be provided on demand. In Boudon's terminology, such empty boxes would be termed white boxes, since their contents are demonstrable and discussable. As Boudon points out, the situation in social theory is quite different. The content of the major components is not made explicit, even though the actual wiring diagrams, the parts and their linkages, have not been specified. As will be suggested below, the wiring diagrams of some of the major subsystems in social theory, concepts like solidarity, intelligence, and understanding, are complex beyond one's wildest imaginings. My purpose is to propose a detailed model of the social bond, one that will specify at least some of the parts and connections in the subsystems. The design of the model begins by applying a theory of the social bond at the micro level, episodes of actual and fictional discourse, by relating the moment-by-moment elements of discourse to the larger context. I suggest how a micro-model might become the basis for a theory of social solidarity. Beginning at the microscopic level is not without peril. Given the extraordinary complexity and richness of detail at this level, it is difficult to reach even to the next level, the total relationship of the particular husband and wife in the interaction, let alone to the macro level, all relationships between husbands and wives. Much of the very fine work that is done in discourse and conversation analysis, to be discussed in subsequent chapters, is limited to the level of discourse alone, the very lowest level, with almost no connection with macro theory. Attempts to proceed down the scale from top, it seems to me, are even more difficult. Giddens, 1984, has led the way with his analysis of slips of the tongue in discourse, using concepts and examples both from Freud and from Goffman. For most settings, however, it may be impossible to link discourse and social structure directly. The relevant parts are too small and various, the relevant wholes too large and abstract. More immediate steps are needed. With a sufficient number of intervening steps, one can play both ends against the middle, working up from the micro level to the level of society, and down again, and up and down in a way that the parts illuminate the whole, and the whole the parts, part-whole analysis. Goffman's analysis of the micro-world can be used to provide some of the intermediate steps. His very detailed description of the ritual conditions for face-to-face interaction, of being in what he called a state of talk, intimates a model of the social bond. Since this issue will be discussed at length in Chapter 5, I will describe only the main contours here. Communication and emotion. Goffman's description of the conditions necessary for a state of talk points to what I will consider to be two different systems of activity. The first, a communication system, the second, a deference emotion system. The first system enables the speakers to make known to each other their thoughts. The second, their evaluation of each other's status. The first system depends mostly on linguistic symbols, the second on nonverbal gestures for the most part. I propose that a normal social bond involves what Goffman calls reciprocal ratification of each of the parties by the other as legitimate participants in the relationship. Although Goffman was thinking only of face-to-face interaction, his description is useful as a starting point for describing an intact social bond, whether the participants are co-present or not. The key idea in Goffman's analysis is legitimacy. Reciprocal ratification of each other's participation involves both feelings and actions of legitimation. Legitimacy serves to bridge the communication and deference emotion systems. Ritually correct forms of communication develop mutual understanding and also serve to award deference. As Goffman's discussion makes clear, ratification of the other's legitimacy must not only be felt, but also expressed. Otherwise, one or both of the parties might feel rejected or excluded to the point that the bond would be threatened. Threats to the social bond generate intense feelings. This proposition lies at the core of my argument. Unlike most who discuss the social encounter, Goffman did not limit his analysis to thought and behavior, but included emotion as an important component. The discussion of states of talk occurs as a part of his analysis of, quote, face, which he relates to feelings and actions that are connected with the social worth of the interactants, and hence to intense feelings. Unlike his predecessor Durkheim, Goffman was quite specific in naming the concrete emotion he saw at the core of the interaction ritual. He proposed that embarrassment, or the anticipation of embarrassment, is the key to understanding face work, as well as what he had earlier called impression management. Although he seldom used the terms pride and shame as Cooley did, his analysis of embarrassment is very much in the spirit of the looking-glass self, and provides an extension of it. I will return to the role of emotion in social bonding below. First, however, it will be helpful to describe the process and structure of successful face work, the state of attunement. As Goffman and others have argued, effective social encounters may result in a single focus of thought and visual attention, which I will call attunement. By attunement, I mean a mutual understanding that is not only mental but also emotional. I do not mean agreement, but rather empathetic intersubjectivity, mind reading. Such attunement can occur as easily in conflict as in cooperation. I will argue, however, that conflicts in which the parties are to some degree attuned have a different quality than when they are not, and usually have different outcomes. By and large, conflict will be constructive to the degree that the parties are attuned, and destructive when they are not. When the social bond is intact, conflict serves the purposes of change and mutual adjustment. Even in the heat of anger, one identifies the opponent as a person like oneself. Even in the act of aggression, Maintenance of the bond is an issue. Prestige as a motive implies intact bonds. The person or group is concerned about its image in the eyes of others. There are obviously conflicts in which the bond is not a consideration. It has been severed or is so threatened that one is willing to risk that it will be cut completely. The opponent is an enemy to be destroyed. In such conflicts, external objects such as money or sex or power may be the sole motives. But an analysis which assumes that such motives are general and preemptive affirms a state of bondlessness, the war of each against all. In a society in which most bonds are intact, money, power, sex, and other such externals may appear to be motives in themselves, but they also symbolize a hidden motive, the maintenance or enhancement of one's standing in the eyes of others. An economics which objectifies money completely ignores a source of money's power as a motive, perhaps the most fundamental one. A political science which focuses on power and procedure rather than prestige and legitimacy makes a similar error. And a behavioral science which focuses on the process of external reinforcement ignores the social motives proposed here. Emerson put it very well. Things are in the saddle, they ride mankind. Things are in the saddle, they ride mankind. Ambiguity and meaning. The relationship between attunement and the social bond is by no means obvious, but needs to be explained. A secure social bond in the animal world does not require intellectual and emotional attunement because bonds are determined by genetically inherited mechanisms. But in the social world, genetic guarantees of bonding have been shattered. Recent studies of infant caretaker interaction suggest that genetic mechanisms still function in the early years of infancy. These studies will be discussed in later chapters. Bonding for adults has an improvised quality. The bond must be constantly tested and renewed if it is to remain intact. For adults, each new situation becomes an arena for an exploration of the nature and degree of the bond. In interaction, the bond is being built or protected or repaired, or it is being damaged. Discourse which focuses entirely on communication, on the exchange of thoughts, which ignores deference and emotion, is apt to damage the bond. As will be discussed, most serious discourse in modern societies usually focuses on the words, on what is said, ignoring the manner, on how it is said. Since the bond-relevant signals are carried for the most part by manner, this practice usually results in further damage to bonds that are already in poor repair. Although every culture develops institutional patterns for signaling bondedness, culture itself has an improvised and therefore massively complex character. Bonding in the animal world is based on unambiguous physical and chemical signals. In the human world, it depends on language, a vast system of signs and signals, mostly arbitrary in nature, and therefore ambiguous in meaning. Levine, 1985. The ambiguity and complexity of human expressions is explored at some length in later chapters. At this point, I will give two brief examples as background. An adult asks a 5-year-old boy to explain the point of soccer. The boy says, "Everybody hates the ball." The adult asks what the boy means. The child realizes they all kick it. He has created a motive to explain the game because he is unaware of the sizable body of rules and understandings the players share about goals, moving the ball with head, hands, feet, and so forth. Although the child's explanation is creative, it is also ignorant and therefore laughable to adults. Computer programs for dealing with ordinary language have similar difficulties. For example, a program furnished 4 paraphrases of the sentence, quote, "Time flies like an arrow." Raphael, 1976. The least erroneous, "Time moves in the same manner that an arrow moves," is not an actual paraphrase. It simply identifies the form of the sentence, but gives no hint of its concrete meaning. In a sense, it takes only the first step in deciphering the meaning, recognizing the type of sentence, a simile rather than a command or a statement of fact. The 3 other paraphrases mistook the meaning. One of the paraphrases can be used to exemplify the others. Quote, Measure the speed of flies in the same way you measure the speed of an arrow, end quote. Time flies like an arrow. Mistaking the noun for a verb and the verb for a noun. The mistake is not an absolute error, but rather misses the meaning within the English-speaking culture. If we assume that virtually every adult speaker of English would recognize the sentence as a simile rather than a command. This example typifies the results of computer treatments of natural language. Even the most sophisticated programs cannot decipher the culturally correct meanings of a sentence in ordinary language. Like the small child confronted with a game of soccer, computer programs lack the background understandings that are necessary to solve the puzzle. The file is too large, the associative pathways too complex, and the words too ambiguous. The complexity of ordinary language was recognized by Wittgenstein long before advent of computers. He realized that understanding and following a seemingly simple rule, stop for red lights, actually involves understanding a whole culture. Parts and wholes. To put it another way, a living culture is an open system, a vast collection of small parts, each having meaning only in relationship to the other and to the whole. In this respect, cultural systems such as natural languages are like functioning organisms. They can be used and understood only by understanding the parts in relation to the whole and the whole in relation to the parts, a vast and complex project. The parts of an open system are holograms. Each stands for the whole, just as the whole is made up by the parts and their interrelationship. A part-whole paradigm is implied in Goethe's work, especially his science. In his far-reaching research in botany on the structure and function of plants, he sensed the importance of relating parts and wholes. 1785, quoted in Fairley, 1963, page 195. In every living thing, what we call the parts is so inseparable from the whole that the parts can only be understood in the whole, and we can neither make the parts the measure of the whole, nor the whole the measure of the parts, and this is why living creatures, even the most restricted, have something about them we cannot quite grasp, and have to describe as infinite or partaking of infinity. End quote. The words in a living language, like parts of the plant, are holograms. They represent and reflect the whole system, as well as serving as minuscule components in it. If ordinary language is so complex that even the most sophisticated computer program cannot understand a single sentence, how do we ever understand each other in everyday discourse? How do we deal with our vast cultural file of ambiguous signs and symbols? This question will be the focus of several chapters. Suffice it here to refer to intuition. Using and understanding ordinary language requires lightning-quick, intuitive understanding of the meaning of expressions in context. By the time we are adults, we have so much experience with this process, and we are so adept at it, that it becomes invisible. Needless to say, intuition often fails, giving rise to misunderstanding, an issue that will be discussed below. By using intuitive understanding, we learn the skill of empathy, of intersubjective awareness, of mind reading. We learn, as Cooley, 1922, page 208, puts it, to live in the mind of others. Quote, "Many people of balanced mind and congenial activity scarcely know that they care what others think of them, and will deny it, perhaps with indignation, that such care is an important factor in what they are and do. But this is an illusion. If failure or disgrace arrives, if one suddenly finds that the faces of men show coldness or contempt instead of the kindliness and deference that he is used to, he will perceive from the shock, the fear, the sense of being outcast and helpless, that he was living in the minds of others without knowing it, just as we daily walk the solid ground without thinking how it bears us up." End quote. What Cooley does not note, however, is that our reading of the minds of others is a varying mixture of understanding and misunderstanding. At times there is an actual attunement, mutual understanding. At other times, however, we are living in the minds of others, but only in our imaginations. We have misunderstood. This possibility introduces a note of complexity into a seemingly simple idea in social science, the concept of consensus. Consensus is ordinarily used in a facile way, as if it were a manner of simple agreement. But agreement can occur between isolated individuals. Limiting consensus to simple agreement involves theoretical and methodological individualism. It ignores the vast structure and process I have been alluding to, the complex process of observation and inference that leads to varying degrees and types of mutual understanding and misunderstanding. The typical study of conflict and consensus, since it uses surveys of isolated individuals, does not tap social relationships, but only verbal indications of agreement and disagreement. A second shortcoming of the prevailing concept of consensus is that it refers only to cognitive understanding, ignoring a component that is probably more important overall for social solidarity: emotional consensus. Although cognitive and emotional consensus are correlated to some degree, there are important tensions between the two levels in modern societies. Bonding between individuals and solidarity between groups both depend on mutual trust, which in turn is usually connected to emotional as well as intellectual ties. Treating social solidarity as if it were entirely a cognitive matter is implied by Durkheim's treatment of mechanical solidarity. He equates it with, quote, like-mindedness, end quote, implying that solidarity involves agreement at the cognitive level. Elsewhere, however, Durkheim intimates the importance of emotions for social solidarity. He devoted considerable space to what he called, quote, the social emotion, end quote, which he saw as of central importance in welding individuals together in a society. However, his treatment is vague. He refers to emotion only in general, never to concrete emotions. He treats emotion as a residual category, that aspect of human conduct which is not behavior or cognition. For that reason, his argument about emotion is inconsequential. Durkheim's theory is not the only one which treats emotion as a residual category. With the already noted exceptions of Cooley and Goffman, all the major social theorists follow this practice. It may be flagrant, as in the case of Skinner, who explicitly states that emotions are effects, not causes. In Parsons' theory of action, emotion in principle is given equal standing with the other components of action. However, since he treats affect only abstractly and residually, it plays little role in his theory. At first glance, emotions seem to play a prominent role in psychoanalytic theory since, as already indicated, specific emotions, anxiety and guilt, form a central part of the psychoanalytic theory of motivation. Anxiety is particularly important in psychoanalytic formulations. It figures in virtually all major propositions. However, a close reading suggests that the concept of anxiety has been extended to the point where it has come to stand for many unnamed emotions, and therefore to function as an undifferentiated and residual category. In Freud's early work, anxiety meant a specific emotion, a type of fear. Its meaning has currently expanded to include all types of diffuse or disguised emotions except for anger and guilt. Guilt is an important ingredient of social bonding, but is used in most theories in a way that disguises its social character, another instance of theoretical individualism. Before explaining my approach to this issue, I must step back from the particulars of my argument to the whole package, a theory that addresses some of the major contradictions in modern societies. Basic premise. Sociology as a discipline arose out of the realization that modernization, the rise of urban, industrial societies, was destructive of community. With social and geographic mobility and the free flow of information, modern societies have a potential for change that would be unthinkable in a traditional society. Although limitless change has many advantages, it also gives rise to a substantial disadvantage. All social bonds are at risk. Not just one bond or another is threatened, but all bonds. One's connections to others are never quite safe. Suppose, as a basic premise, that all human beings require a sense of belonging, a web of secure social bonds, and that for most of us, this minimum is never quite achieved. If that were the case, the human condition in modern societies would be one of permanent insecurity. The sustaining web has been lost. If one allowed oneself to be aware of this loss, Every moment of daily existence would be exquisitely painful. How might a society defend its members against this kind of pain? One defense would be to deny the very existence of the social bond. Individualism provides a defensive myth for organizing experience in an anomic society. Under these conditions, the need for social bonds would become an unmentionable secret, even an unthinkable one. I propose that modern societies have institutionalized two defenses against the loss of secure bonds. The first myth is individualism and the denial and repression of the emotions that are associated with social bonds, pride and shame. The second myth follows from the denial of complexity in human affairs. Human nature and social order are simple matters, easily understood. The last part of this chapter will outline how the concept of the bond, its massive complexity, and the feelings that accompany it are denied and disguised. Children who have undergone the loss of parental care at an early age usually defend themselves against the pain of further separation. The case of Reggie, Burlingham and Freud, 1942, quoted in Bowlby, 1973, illustrates this point. Separated from his parents at 5 months, he formed a passionate attachment to his nurse in the orphanage. This attachment was suddenly broken when he was 2 years, 8 months. His nurse, Mary Ann, left to be married. Quote, he was completely lost and desperate after her departure, and refused to look at her when she visited him a fortnight later. He turned his head to the other side when she spoke to him, but stared at the door, which had closed behind her after she had left the room. In the evening, in bed, he sat up and said, quote, my very own Mary Ann, but I don't like her, end quote. Reggie has defended himself against the pain of his second separation. He has rejected the rejecter. Burlingham and Freud, Bowlby, 1969, and others who have studied the effects of broken or threatened bonds repeatedly report the same syndrome. After a lengthy period of futile calling for the missing loved one, the child learns its lesson. In effect, the child says, like Reggie, quote, very well, if you're not coming, then I don't need you anyway. I'm sufficient unto myself. I don't need any more, ever, end quote. This defense is what Bowen, 1978, calls cutoff. In effect, it is a self-inflicted wound in response to a wounding societal environment. Since one has suffered from the separation in the past, one protects oneself by giving up hope, producing a self-perpetuating system. One limitation of the reports in developmental psychology needs to be mentioned. Bowlby and other researchers seem to assume that severed bonds create more disruption than bonds that are threatened. In effect, they seem to be saying that being a member of a physically intact household, no matter what its emotional dynamics, is less damaging than being an orphan. However, as Bowen's 1978 analysis of family systems suggests, this may not be the case. The threat to bonds in an egoistic, anomic, or altruistic family system is hidden and therefore confusing. The disruption caused by such a family may be more enduring than the disruption suffered from severed bonds. The ideation of severed bonds can be found in the culture of peoples who have been enslaved. A spiritual of the southern black slaves provides an example. Quote, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long, long way from home. A long, long way from home. End quote. The slaves were wrenched not only from their families, but from their cultures. All bonds were severed. Since the destruction of bonds is absolutely clear, however, it may be possible to form new ones. In the white middle-class family, which is physically intact, enemy egoism, or altruism, can arise which is hidden behind a facade of polite words. Conflict is so disguised that its roots are virtually invisible to family members. These are the conditions which give rise to underground conflict in the form of interminable quarrels or silent impasses. Scheff, 1987. Retzinger's 1988 analysis of marital quarrels reports such relationships. They are marked by politeness, but accompanied by emotional distance. lack of trust, and withdrawal of affection. In an earlier paper, Scheff 1989A, on discourse in a family with an anorexic member, I have shown how a daughter and mother were locked in a hidden system of mutual threat. The daughter threatened self-starvation, the mother abandonment of the daughter. The threats, recriminations, and insults exchanged were so subtle they seemed outside the awareness of the family members. In relationships marked by hidden conflict, the bond is continually threatened, but in a way which makes understanding and repair of the bond extremely difficult. Since their prototypic bonds are inadequate, the typical individual in such a family might find it just as difficult to form new bonds as to repair old ones. It is possible for the relationships in a whole society to be physically intact, but based on threatened or inadequate bonds. In such a society, we would expect to find individuals willing to accept social relationships which do not meet their basic needs, but are tolerated because they are felt to be better than isolation and loneliness. In these circumstances, nationalism and other types of sectarian groups may arrive, providing what may be thought of as pseudo-bonds. Rather than attunement, which balances the needs of the individual and the needs of society, pseudo-bonds in nations, sects, cults, and other exclusive groups furnish only the semblance of community. In such sects, the members give up significant parts of themselves, their individual points of view. They are engulfed. Engulfment damages both the individual and the group because competing points of view are needed for adaptation and survival. The prevalence of highly specialized groups in a society might constitute a subtle threat to that society's existence, in a way not foreseen by Tocqueville. Just as optimal differentiation in a family system balances individual and group needs, so optimal differentiation in a social system would balance group and societal needs, the tension between the parts and the whole. An analogy to living organisms may make the point, suggested to me by Frederick Turner. A normal cell is self-reproducing, but it is sufficiently complex that it also functions to maintain the larger organism of which it is a part. A cancer cell is simpler. It is only self-reproducing. Rather than providing service to the host, it destroys it. Hyper-specialized groups in a society and nations in a world system may become analogs to cancer cells. They become only self-reproducing, entirely dedicated to their own survival. They cease to serve the larger system of which they are a part. This process lies at the heart of the triumph of incumbency in the modern world. The ability of office holders, no matter what their coloration, to defeat all contenders. The leaders and followers are ideological. Mannheim, 1936, mesmerized by the status quo. They are such devotees of the status quo that the system ceases to be adaptive to changing conditions. The Reagan-Bush ascendancy is one example. Gorbachev's difficulties suggest the USSR provides another. The ideology of individualism and its corollaries, such as the myth of the self-made man and the denial of complexity, obscures the part-whole nature of social systems. Such an ideology may be an adult parallel to a child's defenses against the intense pain that follows severed or threatened bonds. Those approaches which insist on viewing human issues in terms of isolated individuals driven by simple inner motives may be defenses against the anomic conditions in our society. It will be useful to view these defenses in terms of the psychoanalytic idea of repression. If the ideology of the isolated, self-sufficient individual is a defense against the pain of severed and threatened bonds, what is being repressed is the idea of the importance of the social bond, of individuals being incomplete without a web of secure bonds. Freud, however, argued that repression concerns not only ideas but also the feelings that accompany them. He thought that repression could be lifted only if both idea and emotions were expressed. If modern societies repress the idea of the social bond, what are the associated feelings that are also being repressed? I follow the lead of Cooley and Goffman, whose work implies that pride and shame are the primary social emotions. These two emotions have a a signal function with respect to the social bond. In this framework, pride and shame serve an intense and automatic bodily signs of the state of a system that would be otherwise difficult to observe, the state of one's bonds to others. Pride is the sign of an intact bond, shame a severed or threatened bond. The clearest outer marker of pride is holding up one's head in public and looking others in the eye, but indicating respect by taking turns looking and looking away. In overt shame, one shrinks, averting or lowering one's gaze, casting only furtive glances at the other. In bypassed shame, one stares, attempting to outface the other. Pride and shame serve as instinctive signals, both to self and other, to communicate the state of the bond. We react automatically to affirmations of and threats to our bonds. However, if a culture is sufficiently insistent, it can teach us to disguise and deny these signals. If the idea of the social bond is repressed in modern societies, then we would expect that these two emotions would also be systematically repressed. In the 19th century, pride and shame could be treated openly and directly by Darwin, McDougall, and Cooley. In current discussions, these two emotions have all but disappeared. As indicated, orthodox psychoanalysis glosses over them, and they fare little better in systematic research. Neither emotion is reported, for example, in the research on emotional universals by Ekman and Friesen, 1972. The work of Cooley, Gottman, and Lewis provides the basic ingredients for developing pride and shame constructs. Cooley's and Gottman's analyses have already been mentioned. Cooley's stress on the social nature of pride and shame, particularly his insistence on the ways in which we are unaware of normal pride, points in this direction, as does Gottman's analysis of the crucial role of embarrassment in interaction ritual. The work of the late Helen Lewis, a research psychoanalyst, provides preliminary support for the conjecture about the repression of shame in modern societies. In her empirical work on affects in psychotherapy, she discovered that although other emotions, such as anger, often go unacknowledged, by far the most frequent and least often acknowledged were embarrassment, shame, and humiliation. Since her work will be discussed in later chapters, I will not attempt to outline it here. However, one aspect of Lewis's work is particularly relevant to the conjecture under discussion. Lewis found that in contexts high in potential for shame, for example, when the patient appears to suspect that the therapist is critical or judgmental, nonverbal indications of shame were plentiful, for example, long or filled pauses, well, you know, etc., repetition or self-interruption, and particularly a lowering of the voice, often to the point of inaudibility. In these same contexts, however, shame was virtually never acknowledged by name. Instead, a wide variety of words were used, which Lewis interpreted to be as a code language, a way of mentioning feelings otherwise unmentionable. Feeling words, such as insecure, awkward, and uncomfortable, are a few of the 100 or so similar words often found in these situations. These same words are found in the Gottschalk-Glaser scale used for interpreting shame in verbal texts. When feelings of shame are verbalized, a language is used which seems to deny or at least disguise the feeling itself. This language is analogous to the code language used for designating other unmentionables such as sexual or toilet terms. Like baby talk about body functions with children, the denial of shame is institutionalized in the adult language of modern societies. It is of great interest that laypersons and researchers alike are apt to insist on the differences among the behaviors referenced by shame-variant words, embarrassment, insecurity, etc., rather than acknowledge the underlying similarities. The resulting balkanization may be seen as one aspect of the process of denial and repression. Lewis's findings, like the approaches of Cooley and Gottman, suggests that shame is repressed in modern societies. Although Goffman's and Lewis's treatments of shame are an advance over Cooley's in one way, in another they are retrograde. Their treatments are much more specialized and detailed than Cooley's, whose discussions of the self-regarding sentiments are quite casual and brief, conveyed in ordinary language. But Cooley had a vision of the whole system, which is lacking in the more recent discussions. His treatment is explicitly based on the polar opposition between pride and shame in everyday encounter. It therefore lays the basis for my construct of the social bond, with pride and shame as continuous signals of the state of the bond, an instant readout of the temperature of the relationship. The emotion of pride is completely absent from Goffman's and Lewis's formulations. The omission of pride by Goffman is particularly disastrous. Since Lewis is dealing with psychotherapy discourse, we are free to imagine that in normal conversation there would be much more pride than shame. But Goffman's formulations concerning impression management, face, and embarrassment presume to be about normal discourse, leaving the reader with the impression that all human activity is awash in a sea of shame. He nowhere envisioned a secure social bond, much less a well-ordered society built upon secure bonds. Goffman's omission of pride and secure bonds is a disaster because it implies that impression management is the only game in town. In this way, it indirectly sanctions what I call the bella figura syndrome. The Italians say, fare una bella figura. That is, by all means cut a good figure, no matter what the cost. To translate the bella figura syndrome into English, one might call it the Bush-Reagan syndrome. At the level of individuals, this syndrome is merely destructive. To the level of nations, it threatens human survival. With respect to Goffman's and Lewis's treatments of shame, it would appear that social theory has both evolved and devolved at the same time. We are now in a position to interpret the view of guilt and anxiety as elemental emotions in psychoanalysis, and similar treatments in other disciplines, such as anthropology and classics, Dodd's 1951. I will argue, as Lewis does, that guilt is one of the many types of affect belonging to the shame family. If that were the case, then the emphasis on guilt and anxiety, individual emotions, in psychoanalytic and similar formations, can be seen as an aspect of the repression of the idea of the social bond in modern society. That is to say, that anxiety and guilt are used in most theories in a way that denies their social component, shame. The use of catch-all emotion words functions to disguise the social components of emotion. The disguise involved is often a matter of labeling, of linguistic convention. For example, the phrases social anxiety and social fear virtually never reference the feeling of anticipated danger to life or limb. Instead, they almost always involve the anticipation of embarrassment. In this usage, the suppression of the correct name of the affect is superficial, since it involves only one layer, mislabeling. In many usage, however, the denial of shame or embarrassment is not merely a linguistic habit, but also involves defenses that are at least partially automatic and unconsidered. The sentence, "It was an awkward moment for me," almost always refers to embarrassment. In this usage, however, embarrassment is disguised by two defensive movements, denial and a projection. It was not me that was embarrassed, but the moment that was awkward. The disguise in this case can be envisioned as involving two layers rather than just one layer, a misleading label, as in the case of social fear. The example of the awkward moment provides an example of the way in which our very language conspires to deny the existence of shame. The repression of shame, and thereby of the social bond, is institutionalized. The depth of repression of pride and shame is indicated by the absence of these two emotions from the frameworks proposed by Bowlby and Bowen, two of the principal architects of sociological thinking in psychiatry. Although Bowen has pioneered the social system approach in family therapy, and Bowlby the concept of the social bond in human development, neither of them utilizes the concepts of pride and shame, Instead, they both categorize all diffuse or ambiguous emotion as anxiety, the catch-all term. After Lewis, Galen has shown the most sensitivity to pride and shame in his Typology of Feelings, 1979, and his treatment of the sources of rage, 1989. Although he does not provide explicit constructs of pride and shame, these two emotions play a prominent role in many of his interpretations. However, his framework is oriented towards individuals. It lacks the emphasis on social relations found in Bowen and Bowlby. Unless a framework is fashioned, which includes both elements, the social bond and its associated emotions of pride and shame, the human sciences will stay entrapped in the ideology of simplicity and individualism. Feeling traps. Goffman's treatment of embarrassment and Lewis's of shame suggest that these emotions have a characteristic that makes them especially potent and preeminent in human conduct: recursiveness, acting back on themselves in never-ending loops. Goffman suggests that embarrassment is especially contagious between interactant, and Lewis within them. Lewis suggests that the original stimulus for shame, say a comment that one takes to be critical of self, may be only the first step in a long sequence of shame. Once ashamed, one can be ashamed of being ashamed, each shamed state serving as stimulus for further shame. For this reason, she implies, it is possible for shame-prone persons to be in more or less chronic shame state. Goffman advances a parallel argument for the contagion of embarrassment between interactant. One becomes embarrassed that the other is embarrassed, who in turn becomes more embarrassed, and so on. He proposes this kind of contagion as one of the reasons that one may attempt to avoid embarrassing others, since the other's embarrassment may result in one's own. As already suggested, I define the concept of shame in a way that will include many emotions that are often used as if they were unrelated. Embarrassment is one such affect. I will consider embarrassment to be a type of shame, one in which is of lesser intensity and briefer duration, and in which the pain of arousal is experienced in awareness. That is to say, embarrassment is a less intense, brief, and overtly experienced form of shame. Given this definition, it is possible to combine Lewis's model of inner contagion of shame and Goffman's of outer. Shame states have the potential for being extraordinarily intense and protracted because they can be contagious within and between interactants. I refer to such social and psychological loops as triple spirals, one within each interactant and one between them. Triple spirals of shame contagion could give rise to shame states of unlimited intensity or duration. I have already proposed that shame is deeply repressed and denied in modern societies because it is linked to anomie, the prevalence of threatened or severed social bonds. The recursiveness of shame suggests the fundamental basis for repression. Loops of shame, like those described above, can be so violently painful that one might wish to avoid them at any cost. I propose that, just as normal pride and shame are necessary because they serve as signals for the state of social bonds, unacknowledged shame could be the root cause of chains of threatened bonds, of the transmission of threat from person to person in an ongoing society, and from generation to generation over time. By studying the micro-world of manner and implication that underlies discourse, one may retrieve the hidden causal chain, the unacknowledged shame that leads to compulsive behavior, the continuing repression of the idea of the social bond, of its accompanying emotions of pride and shame, and of human complexity, could be the root cause, however, of the profound social disruption we are witnessing in the modern era. The language of laypersons and experts in modern societies systematically denies the social bond and the emotions. Repression of the idea of the bond and of the emotions of pride and shame is institutionalized. My book proposes the need for a new language based on models of bond-relevant behavior, with emphasis on the complexity of behavior and on the key role of sequences of emotion. Conclusion. The attempt to capture human nature and social structure To envision the parts and wholes of a massively complex social and psychological system within a single paradigm is not a simple task. In writing the ensuing chapters, directed on different occasions to different aspects of the overall system, I have not been able to develop a completely linear argument. Since I have fished with many lines, they are frequently tangled. Using lines more original than mine, Wittgenstein 1953 IX fished the same ocean. His apology to his readers I also offer to mine. Quote, "It is necessary to depict landscapes by images and remarks because of the nature of the investigation. For this compels us to travel over a wide field of thought, crisscross in every direction. The remarks in this book are, as it were, a number of sketches of landscapes, which were made in the course of these long and involved journeyings. The same or almost the same points were always being approached from different directions, and new sketches made. Thus this book is really only an album." End quote. I have attempted to weld together parts of landscapes from the albums of Cooley, Goffman, Lewis, and many others into a coherent whole, but like them, I have also produced an album. The next step is to discuss a problem intimately connected with the social bond, the relationship between community and society.